Oh, you're here. Good. I was hoping for company. You see, I've got stories, dark ones, chilling ones, the kind that keep you up at night. Mythical creatures, curses, horrors you can't escape. Shall we begin? Don't worry, I won't bite. Much.
This story was passed down by someone who swore it was true. The protagonist was his uncle. The winter of 1943 was one of the darkest times for northeast China under Japanese occupation. Ethan, a young man of mixed heritage, had a Chinese mother and a Soviet merchant father who had disappeared years ago. He grew up on the streets of Harbin, speaking fluent Mandarin and Russian, along with some Manchu phrases he had picked up over the years. Ethan's childhood was rough fistfights, running errands for gamblers, and selling newspapers, cigarettes, and alcohol on the streets. But one day, he angered a rich patron at a casino and soon found himself hunted down by a group of enforcers. With nowhere else to run, he made a desperate escape into the vast, uncharted wilderness of the Greater Khingan Mountains. But the forest was no place for a city boy. The unforgiving cold seeped into his bones, hunger gnawed at his stomach, and each night the howls of wolves reminded him that this was a place where only the strong survived. Just as he was on the verge of collapse, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, an old Orochian hunter. The man was well past 60, his face lined like the bark of an ancient tree, shaped by time and hardship. His sharp, hawk-like eyes studied Ethan in silence. Then, without a word, he handed Ethan a piece of dried meat and led him to his small, secluded hut. Thus began Ethan's new life in the deep mountains. Over time, Ethan learned the ways of the Orochian people, the indigenous hunters of the Greater Khingan. He learned how to skin deer, preserve meat with tree resin, and craft tools from animal bones. Most importantly, he learned to use the deer call, a simple wooden whistle that mimicked the cry of a female deer, luring in unsuspecting stags for the hunt. As the years passed, Ethan became more than just an outsider. He became the old hunter's apprentice, and in time, a son. One day, his father figure decided it was time. "You're ready," the old man said. "Go hunt on your own." Excited yet nervous, Ethan grabbed his rifle and deer call, stepping into the depths of the forest. He found a clearing near a river and crouched low, bringing the wooden whistle to his lips. A long, high-pitched sound echoed through the trees. Then, the sound of hooves on snow. Ethan looked up, expecting to see an ordinary stag. Instead, standing by the riverbank was something out of legend. A massive white deer, its fur pure as fresh snow, drinking quietly from the water. Its towering antlers, stretching high into the sky, had at least 9 branches, covered in patches of green moss, as if blessed by the forest itself. Ethan froze. His heart pounded. This was no ordinary deer. The old hunter had once told him, "A mature stag grows 4, maybe 5 branches on its antlers. But if you ever see one with more than that, and if its fur is as white as the moon, do not shoot." Ethan held his breath. The white deer lifted its head, meeting his gaze. For several long moments, man and beast simply stared at each other. Then, as if satisfied, the deer turned and vanished into the misty forest, its presence fading like a dream. Ethan rushed back to the hut, breathless. When he told the old hunter what he had seen, the man raised both hands toward the sky and whispered an ancient prayer in the Orochian language. "The white deer has appeared, a sign from the spirits. Today is a day of peace. No blood shall be spilled. For the first time, Ethan understood the deep reverence the Orokin held for the forest and its sacred inhabitants. Years passed. The old hunter, now frail and sick, suffered from unbearable joint pain. The harsh winters and his lifetime of exposure to the damp forest air had taken their toll. Each night, his body ached so terribly he could barely sleep. Ethan, desperate to help, decided to take him to Harbin for medical treatment. But there was one problem. They had no money. One day, while in town trading furs, Ethan overheard a conversation. Rich merchants were paying high prices for bear bile and paws. One fully grown brown bear could be worth 2 gold bars, enough to cover medical expenses and take the old hunter somewhere warm to live out his days. Ethan made up his mind, but he also knew he could never tell the old hunter. The Orokin people held strict taboos about hunting bears. Only a shaman or tribal leader could approve a bear hunt. Bears were sacred. They were the guardians of the forest, and killing one required a large ritual to atone for the act. Worst of all, if a bear had any unusual markings, such as white fur, it was said that the hunter who killed it would be cursed, possibly even to death. But Ethan was willing to risk it. So, without telling the old man, he took his rifle and ventured into the mountains, determined to hunt a bear. Ethan had hunted in this forest for years. He knew every stream, every valley, every tree. But that day, something was different. As he ventured deeper, a dense fog suddenly rolled in, thicker than he had ever seen before. In mere moments, the entire landscape vanished into a sea of swirling white. Ethan stopped. He turned to retrace his steps, but his footprints had disappeared. He was lost. The forest around him, which had always been so familiar, now felt like a different world entirely. No matter which direction he walked, he ended up back where he started. Something was wrong. The sun began to set, and the cold crept into his bones. He needed shelter, fast. Then, through the fog, a faint path appeared, barely visible, but leading somewhere. With no other choice, Ethan followed it. After an hour of walking, Ethan stumbled upon a cave nestled into the mountainside. Cautiously, he knocked against the stone walls to check for hidden animals. No response. Lighting a torch, he stepped inside. The passage twisted before opening into a wide clearing, and what he saw made his breath catch. 2 men were already inside. They were wounded. Their clothes were tattered, stained with dried blood. Their faces, though unfamiliar, were clearly not Han Chinese, likely Orokin or Evenke tribesmen. One was older, maybe in his 50s, his face pale and body too weak to stand. The other was younger, around 30, his left arm wrapped in bloody cloth, his right hand gripping a hunting knife. For a moment, the 3 men simply stared at each other in silence. Then Ethan spoke in the Orokin language. "I am a hunter, not an enemy." The younger man's expression changed. Surprise. "You speak our tongue?" he asked cautiously. Ethan nodded. "I got lost in the fog and found this cave. Do you need help?" The young man hesitated before finally nodding. "We are warriors," he said, voice heavy with exhaustion. "We were fighting the Japanese, but after a battle, we were forced to scatter. Wounded, lost. We cannot go any further." Ethan understood. Something, or someone, had led him to this cave, and maybe it wasn't an accident. The cave was damp and cold, but it was safer than staying outside in the thick fog. Ethan quickly set up a small fire in the cave, using his flint and some dry branches he carried in his bag. The younger man, who introduced himself as Urshan, watched him closely while the older man, Sue, leaned against the wall, too weak to say much. Ethan took out some sugar, dried meat, and water, handing them over. Urshan hesitated at first, but eventually he accepted them with a quiet, "Thank you." Ethan then pulled out a bottle of strong liquor he always carried for emergencies. He used it to clean their wounds before carefully bandaging them with spare strips of cloth. As he worked, Urshan finally spoke again. "The forest led you here." Ethan glanced up. The way Urshan said it didn't sound like a coincidence. "You believe that?" he asked. Urshan nodded. "In times of crisis, the spirits of the forest guide those who listen. You did not find this cave by accident." Ethan didn't respond, but deep inside, he couldn't ignore the strange feeling in his chest. The same feeling he had when he first saw the white deer years ago. That night, Ethan kept watch while Urshan and Sue rested. Outside, the mist swirled, thick as ever. But just as he started to relax, a deep, heavy breathing sound echoed through the fog. His grip on the rifle tightened. Then, a shadow moved. It was massive. A bear. Urshan woke instantly. His instincts kicked in, and his hand went straight for his knife. But Ethan stopped him with a quiet shake of his head. "It's not attacking." The bear had stopped at the cave entrance. It wasn't growling, nor was it preparing to charge. Instead, it simply stood there, looking at them. The firelight flickered, reflecting in its deep, black eyes. The bear exhaled a cloud of mist into the cold air. Ethan had hunted bears before. He knew this was not normal behavior. "It's waiting for us." Urshan's face changed. He slowly stood up, looking at the bear with an expression of deep reverence. "This is a sign," he murmured. "The forest is guiding us out." Ethan wasn't sure what to believe, but at this moment, he didn't feel fear. He turned to Sue, helped him up, and gestured for Urshan to follow. Slowly, cautiously, they stepped out of the cave, moving behind the massive bear. And the bear, it led the way. For hours, they followed the bear through the mist. It moved at a steady pace, not once looking back, as if it already knew they were behind it. The forest had completely transformed from the one Ethan once knew. There were no familiar landmarks, no known trails, only an endless sea of white fog curling around the trees like ghostly hands. Yet, despite this, they never lost their way. The bear led them forward, its hulking form cutting through the thick mist. Then, as dawn began to break, something changed. The air became lighter. The trees around them became clearer. And then, the mist slowly started to fade. Before them, the outline of the forest, as they knew it, emerged from the haze. The path ahead was familiar again. They had made it out. Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. But just as they took their final steps out of the mist, a sound stopped them in their tracks. A deep, echoing call. A deer's cry. They turned, and there, standing just a few meters away, was the white deer. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. The white deer stood tall, its golden eyes watching them with an unreadable expression. Even in daylight, its fur seemed to glow, an ethereal presence against the backdrop of the fading mist. Urshan and Sue both froze. Then, as if guided by instinct, they both lowered their heads in reverence. Ethan didn't move. His mind raced, trying to understand why the deer had appeared, why it had come to them now. The white deer took one step forward, then another. It wasn't afraid. It was watching them, acknowledging them. Then, after a long, silent moment, it slowly turned. and walked back into the forest. The trees swallowed it whole, its form dissolving into the shadows of the wild. Ethan knew they would never see it again, and yet, in his heart, he felt something change. When they finally returned to the village, Urshan and Sue were immediately taken to a small medical station in town. Before they left, Urshan clasped Ethan's arm. "You were chosen to find us. We owe you our lives." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded. But as he watched them leave, his heart grew heavy. He had saved them, but he had failed his original mission. He hadn't killed a bear. He had no money. And that meant he had no way to take the old hunter to Harbin for treatment. When he returned to the hut and told the old man what had happened, the elder lifted his hands to the sky and whispered a long prayer. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. Instead, he was grateful. "The spirits protected you, my son. You were never meant to kill that bear. It was not your fate." Ethan clenched his fists. "But we still don't have money. We can't get you to a doctor." The old hunter simply smiled. "This is the way of things. We do not fight the will of the forest." Winter came, and by the time the snows melted in spring, the old hunter was gone. Ethan buried him near the hut, under the shade of an ancient pine. For 2 more years, he remained in the mountains, unable to let go. But one evening, standing on a ridge overlooking the vast wilderness, he heard a familiar sound, a distant deer's cry. He turned. In the far distance, just barely visible among the trees, was a white shape. It didn't come closer. It didn't linger. It was simply watching. Ethan closed his eyes, and in that moment, he knew it was time to leave. He took one last breath of the cold mountain air. Then he turned back toward the town, toward Harbin, toward the world he once knew. And as he walked away, the forest remained, eternal and untamed, guarded by spirits that would never be forgotten.